There are moments on a stage that the stage was not built for. Not because the stage fails, the lights stay on, the cameras keep running, the microphones keep working, but because what arrives in the room is larger than entertainment, larger than competition, larger than the specific, formatted purpose the room was designed to serve. And what the room becomes in those moments is something that no production schedule accounts for and no host prepares for, and that arrives, when it arrives, with the complete, unannounced authority of something that is simply true. This is a story about one of those moments. About a man named Walter who was 95 years old when he walked onto a Family Feud stage, and who was, by any available measure, the most extraordinary person to have stood at that microphone in 14 years of the show. Not because of what he had done, though what he had done was considerable. Not because of who he was, though who he was enough. But because of what he said when Steve Harvey asked him about his wife, the woman he had been married to for 71 years and who had been gone for 3, and what she had done the week before she died that Walter had never told anyone, and that he told Steve Harvey on a game show stage, quietly and without drama, in the way that a man tells the most important story of his life when he has finally found a room large enough to say it in. And about what Steve Harvey did when he heard it. Which was walk off stage, not because he was leaving, because he needed 60 seconds to be a human being before he could be a host again, and because the room understood the difference. Hit that like button and subscribe right now before we go any further, because this channel is here for exactly these stories, for the moments that remind us what it means to be loved and to love someone for 71 years, and we come back with one every single week. Now let us talk about Walter. Walter Gaines was 95 years old and had been born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1929, which meant he had been born into a world that was arranged, in ways both legal and social, to prevent a man who looked like him from being more than the world had decided he could be, and that he had spent 95 years being considerably more. Through the specific combination of intelligence and stubbornness and grace, and the refusal to accept the world's accounting of what was possible for him that had been the organizing principle of his life, since he was old enough to understand what the accounting said. He had served in the army during the Korean War and had come home to a country that was not sure what to do with him, which was the experience of most black veterans of that war, and he had come home anyway and had made something of the coming home. He had worked for 31 years at a manufacturing plant in Cleveland, Ohio, not in management, not because he was not capable of management, but because the plant in 1954 did not promote black workers into management. And he had done the work with the specific, steady competence of a man who understood that the quality of the work was the one thing in the building entirely under his control, and who had decided, accordingly, to make it excellent. He had built a house. He had raised 4 children. He had been, by every account offered by the people who knew him, the kind of man that words like integrity and dignity described without diminishing, the kind of man those words had been invented for before they became words people said at funerals without always meaning them fully. Walter meant them. He had spent 95 years meaning them. His wife Ruth had been 93 when she died, 3 years before the taping. They had been married for 71 years. The kind of 71 years that contains everything a marriage can contain. The early years of establishing, the middle years of building and raising and sometimes struggling, the later years of the specific, practiced, deeply ordinary companionship of 2 people who have shared everything for so long that the sharing has become the structure of who they are, so that when one of them is gone, the other is not just bereaved but architecturally altered. Changed in the specific way that buildings are changed when a load-bearing wall is removed, still standing, still themselves, but different in a way that is felt in every room. Walter had been living in the difference for 3 years. He had been living in it with the specific, patient, eyes-open steadiness of a man who had decided, at 92, that whatever time remained was going to be lived fully, because Ruth would have required it of him, and because he owed her the living as much as he owed her anything. His granddaughter Keisha was 38 and was a physical therapist who had been the closest to Walter of all the grandchildren, who had been the one who visited most, who called most, who had inherited the most visible strand of Walter's specific combination of directness and warmth, and who carried it in the particular, updated way of a 38-year-old woman who had grown up with its example. She had organized the Family Feud application because she had calculated, with the accuracy of someone who understood the man she was dealing with, that Walter would find the challenge interesting, that he would be good at it, and that an afternoon of being excellent at something in a room full of people was exactly the kind of afternoon he needed more of. She had been right on all 3 counts. Walter's daughter Evelyn, 68, was a retired schoolteacher who had her father's steadiness and her own particular gentleness, and who had been beside Walter more than anyone in the 3 years since Ruth, doing the specific, quiet, continuous work of loving someone through their grief without making the grief about yourself. Walter's grandson Marcus, 35, was a construction project manager who had Walter's build and his directness, and a sense of humor he deployed carefully and accurately, which was the family sense of humor, understated and precise. And Walter's great-granddaughter Zoe, 17, was a high school junior who had grown up hearing stories about Walter and Ruth her entire life, and who had, from those stories, the particular quality of a young person who has been given a very clear and very human example of what love looked like sustained over a very long time, and who was still figuring out what to do with that example, and who was doing the figuring with the alert. Careful attention that 17 years of being Zoe had built in her. They had practiced. Keisha had run the practice sessions with the organized, practical efficiency of a physical therapist managing a patient's recovery, establishing the framework, drilling the responses, building the confidence through repetition. Walter had participated in the practice with the specific, fully engaged quality of a 95-year-old man who did not do things halfway, who had been raised in an era and in circumstances that required everything you had, and who had never fully unlearned the requirement. He was better in practice than any of them had anticipated. He was fast, his mind, at 95, had the specific, fleet quality of a very old intelligence that had been in constant use for 95 years, and that had therefore remained quick in the way that things remain quick when they are used without interruption. His instincts for the survey were good, in the particular way of a man who had spent 95 years understanding how people worked, and what they said, and what they meant by what they said, which was exactly what Family Feud required. The opposing family was the Chen family from Columbus, a warm, competitive family of 5 who had organized themselves with excellent energy and strategy, and who had arrived ready to win, and who were going to have the specific experience of being a good team in an afternoon that was not going to be about the competition. When Walter Gaines walked onto the Family Feud stage, slowly, with the deliberate, upright, unhurried walk of a 95-year-old man who moved at the pace his body required, and who had made peace with that pace without making peace with stopping, the studio audience received him with a quality of attention that was different from the standard reception. Not louder, not more demonstrative, but different in texture, the specific, instinctive, recognizing quality of attention that a room produces when it understands that it is in the presence of something that has traveled a very long way to be there. Steve Harvey saw Walter walking toward him, and the expression on Steve Harvey's face was not the warm, professional welcome he extended to every contestant. It was something more personal than that, the expression of a man who had been greeting people for 14 years and who had just understood that the person walking toward him was unlike anyone who had walked toward him before, and who was receiving that understanding in real time. He extended his hand to Walter. Walter took it. The handshake was the specific, firm, complete handshake of a man who had learned to shake hands in an era when a handshake meant something and who had never devalued the currency. Steve Harvey held the handshake for a moment longer than the standard handshake, in the instinctive way of someone who is receiving something through their hand that they want to receive fully. He said, "Sir, how old are you?" Walter said, 95. Steve Harvey said, 95 years old. He said it with the specific, genuine awe of a man doing the arithmetic. He said, "You were born in 1929. Walter said, "Birmingham." Steve Harvey said, "Birmingham, Alabama, 1929. He paused. He looked at Walter with the full, direct attention of someone who understood what those 3 words contained, the specific, comprehensive weight of being born black in Birmingham in 1929, the world that contained, and the world that was crossed, and the distance between the two. He said, "Sir, what are you doing on my show?" Walter looked at him with the expression that was going to become, in the months that followed, one of the most recognized expressions in the clip. The expression of a 95-year-old man receiving an excellent question with the unhurried, certain quality of someone who had been living the answer for 95 years and who knew exactly what it was. He said, "My granddaughter told me to." Steve Harvey produced the laugh that the room had been waiting for, the full, genuine, complete laugh of a man who has been given the perfect answer, and who has no performance available, only the response. The audience joined it. Keisha, standing beside her grandfather, had the expression of a woman whose plan was working exactly as she had hoped. Steve Harvey gathered himself. He looked at Walter with the genuine, comprehensive attention that the man required. He asked about Birmingham, about the Army, about 31 years at the plant. Walter answered each question with the specific, direct, undramatic accuracy of a man reporting the facts of his life without embellishing them, because the facts did not need embellishment. He said what had happened and why and what he had done about it, and what had come of doing it. And what came through the saying of it was not the catalogue of difficulties, but the quality of the man who had navigated them. The specific, grounded, patient intelligence that had looked at each thing as it arrived, and had found the way through it, and had kept going. Steve Harvey listened with the complete, still attention of a man who understood that he was in the presence of a kind of testimony that the stage did not produce often, and that required everything he had to receive fully. Then Steve Harvey asked about Ruth. He asked it naturally in the flow of the conversation, the way he asked about spouses, as part of understanding who someone was and where they had come from. He said, "Tell me about your wife." Walter was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone struggling to find words. The silence of someone who has so many words that they need a moment to choose the right ones. He said, "Ruth and I were married 71 years. Steve Harvey said, 71 years. He said it with the respect the number required. He said, "Is she here today?" Walter said, "She passed 3 years ago." The room received this. The specific, quiet reception of a room that has just understood that something it was in the presence of included grief, and was receiving the grief with the respect that grief required when it arrived in a room. Steve Harvey said, "I'm sorry." Walter said, "Thank you." He said it in the way that people say thank you for "I'm sorry" when they have received the condolence enough times to have found the way to receive it gracefully, which is itself a kind of grieving, the grieving that produces manners for the grief, that learns how to accept the acknowledgement and move through it. He said, "She was something." Steve Harvey said, "Tell me something about her." He said it simply, in the way he asked things when he wanted to know the answer. Not as a host filling airtime, but as a man asking another man about the woman the other man had loved for 71 years. Walter looked at him. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way he had been quiet before, the gathering quiet of a man choosing. And then he said something that he had never said to anyone, that he had been holding for 3 years without finding the right room for it, that arrived here now on a game show stage because the room had asked and because the man who had asked was actually listening. He said, "The week before she died, Ruth knew she was going, the doctors knew, we knew. She was 93 and her body was finishing." He paused. She didn't want to talk about the dying. She never had been one for making things bigger than they needed to be. He paused again. "But one night that week, I was sitting in the chair beside her bed, the way I had been every night. She asked me to bring her the box from the top shelf of the closet. The brown box," she said. She had never mentioned a brown box. He stopped. The room was completely, entirely still. Not the performed stillness of an audience being respectful, but the genuine stillness of a room that is holding its breath because it does not want to disturb what is happening. Walter said, "I brought her the box. She opened it. Inside were letters, every letter I had ever written her. 71 years of letters, she had kept every one." He paused. His voice did not break. He was a man who had been holding this for 3 years and who had found in holding it a way to hold it that was steady even when it was heavy. He said, "And she had put them in order. The first letter I ever wrote her when I was courting her on top. And she gave them back to me. She said, 'These belong to you now.' And she said, 'I want you to know I read every one every time things got hard.' And then she said," he stopped for a moment. He looked at his hands. He looked up at Steve Harvey. She said, 'You have been a good man, Walter. I want you to know that I know it.'" The room did not make a sound. Steve Harvey was looking at Walter Gaines. He had been looking at him through the whole of the story with the complete, unmoving, full attention of a man receiving something that required him to be entirely present. He was not performing the receiving. He was doing it. His expression, which had been the warm, genuine, attentive expression of someone listening carefully, had changed in the specific way that a person's expression changes when something has arrived that is larger than the expression they came in with. He was very still. He stood with what Walter had said for a long moment. The audience was still standing in the stillness they had found when the story began and had not left. Steve Harvey said, and his voice had a quality it did not usually have, a quality that was not the professional voice and was not the performance voice, but was the voice that was left when both of those were not adequate. He said, "Excuse me for just one moment." He looked at Walter. He said, "I'll be right back." And then he walked off stage. He walked into the wings. He was gone for 60 seconds. 60 seconds in which the room held what it was holding, held Walter at the podium and the story in the air, and the audience in the specific, complete, fully human stillness of people who had been somewhere real and who were staying there. Keisha, beside her grandfather, put her hand through his arm. Walter received it. He looked at the audience with the patient, composed, entirely present expression of a man who was used to rooms waiting for him and who knew how to wait with them. Steve Harvey came back. He walked back onto the stage. His eyes were bright. He was composed, the professional composure of a man who has given himself the 60 seconds he needed and who is back fully and who is not going to make the moment about himself. He walked back to Walter. He looked at him with the direct, steady attention that he had been giving him all afternoon. He said, "I apologize, I had to take a minute." Walter said, "Take all the time you need." Steve Harvey said, and it was quiet and it was entirely genuine, 71 years, and the week before she died, she gave you back your own words. She said you were a good man. She wanted you to know she knew it. He paused. "Sir, that woman loved you," Walter said. "I know she did." He said it without sentimentality and without performance. The plain, direct statement of a man who has known something to be true for 71 years and who is reporting it the way he reported everything, accurately and without embellishment. He said, "And I loved her, every day of it, even the hard days, especially the hard days." Steve Harvey looked at Zoe, 17 years old, standing at the end of the family podium, who had grown up hearing the stories of Walter and Ruth, and who was now in the room where one of those stories was being told for the first time in the original voice to an audience of everyone. Zoe had tears on her face. She was not managing them. She was a 17-year-old in the presence of something real, and she was receiving it as a 17-year-old receives something real, which was directly and completely, and with nothing in between the experience and the face. Steve Harvey looked at Zoe and looked back at Walter. He said, "Your great-granddaughter is standing over there finding out what love looks like." Walter looked at Zoe. He looked at her with the expression that a man at 95 has for the young person in his family who is just beginning. The expression that contains the whole distance between 95 and 17, and that looks at the 17 with the specific tenderness of someone who remembers being near the beginning and who knows what the beginning is the beginning of. He said, "She already knows. She grew up watching it." Zoe, 17, standing at the end of the podium with tears on her face, nodded in the specific, sincere, completely unsophisticated way of someone who has just been seen accurately by someone they love. Steve Harvey looked at the room. He said in the voice that was his truest voice, "I want to say something to everyone watching this. Not everybody gets 71 years. Not everybody gets a brown box with their letters in order. But everybody gets the question that Walter just answered, which is, what did you do with the time you had, and did the person beside you know how much you meant it?" He looked at Walter. He said, "This man has his answer. He has had it for 71 years, and she made sure he knew she had it too." He paused. "That is the whole thing. That is everything." He said, "Let's play some Family Feud." Walter Gaines played Family Feud at 95 years old with the specific, fully engaged, unhurried excellence of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it. He was fast in the specific, fleet way of his mind, not young fast, not the reflex speed of someone in their 20s or 30s, but the experienced fast of someone who had been reading situations accurately for 95 years, and who recognized quickly what was being asked and knew quickly what the answer was. He was right more than he was wrong. He delivered each answer with the same direct, undramatic accuracy with which he had delivered everything all afternoon, the accuracy of a man who had spent 95 years saying what he meant. Keisha was excellent in the specific way she had anticipated being, organized and fast and precise, with the physical therapist's accurate read of what the situation required at each moment, and the granddaughter's deep understanding of the man beside her and how he moved and what he needed. Evelyn was warm and steady. Marcus was direct and precise. Zoe, who had been, since Walter's story, in a particular quality of alert, shining presence that was the specific quality of a 17-year-old who has just been given something to aspire to, and who is aspiring immediately. Zoe was better than anyone had expected, fast with the specific, instinctive speed of someone who was answering from the same observational intelligence that had been watching Walter and Ruth her whole life, and that was, it turned out, the right intelligence for this game. The Gaines family won the main game. They went to fast money. Walter went first. There was no question about this. Keisha had determined it in the planning, and Walter had agreed, and the room understood it without discussion. He walked to the fast money podium. He walked with the same deliberate, upright, unhurried walk he had arrived with, the walk that moved at the pace his body required and that did not apologize for the pace, and that covered the distance with complete, quiet dignity. He stood at the podium. He looked out at the room. The room looked back at him. Steve Harvey looked at Walter from across the stage. He said, "Walter Gaines, born 1929, Birmingham, Alabama, 95 years old, married 71 years. This one's for Ruth." Walter looked at the camera. He said, and it was the first time he had directed anything at the camera, the first time he had acknowledged it directly. He said, "This one's for Ruth." Steve Harvey hit the button. Walter Gaines answered 5 Family Feud survey questions in 25 seconds. The producers had quietly extended the timer by 5 seconds, which no one announced, and which Walter did not know, and which did not matter because he needed 22. With the complete, unhurried, entirely accurate intelligence of a man who had been reading what people said and meant, and needed for 95 years, and who found 5 survey questions on this afternoon something close to easy. He said each answer in the plain, direct voice of someone who had always said what he meant and who meant what he said, and the board received each answer the way the board received answers that were right, which was by lighting up. 5 answers. 4 were number 1. The 5th was number 2, which arrived from Walter with the precise, unhurried delivery of a man who was not going to rush the final answer even at the end of Fast Money on national television, because rushing was not something Walter Gaines did. Keisha scored 89 additional points. The combined total was 283 points. The Gaines family had won $20,000. Steve Harvey stood in front of Walter Gaines with the check. He held it between them. He looked at this man who had been born in Birmingham in 1929 and who had served and worked and built and loved and lost and was still here, 95 years old on a game show stage in the winter of 2024, fully present and fully himself and not an inch smaller than he had ever been. He said, "I am going to give you this check, and I am going to tell you something." He paused. "In 14 years of doing this show, I have talked to thousands of people. Thousands. And I have never," he paused, "never had a conversation that I am going to carry the way I am going to carry this one." He looked at Walter with the direct, full attention of a man making a true statement. "Ruth kept every letter. She put them in order, and she said, 'You have been a good man, Walter, and I want you to know I know it.'" He said the sentence in Walter's words the way it had been said. "Sir, she knew. She always knew, and she made sure you knew she knew before she left." He stopped. He said, "That is a love story." Walter took the check with both hands. He looked at it. He looked at Keisha, who was beside him, who had arranged the afternoon. He said, "Thank you for making this happen." Keisha said, "Thank you for saying yes." He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Zoe, who was still in the quality of presence she had found when the story was told, the alert, shining, aspirational presence of someone who had just been given something to grow toward. He said to Zoe from across the stage, "Write him letters." Zoe, 17, said, "What?" Walter said, "Whoever he is, whoever she is, write them letters, keep them, you'll want them later." Zoe received this. She received it with the expression of someone who has just been given the most important piece of advice they have ever received and who knows it and who is going to keep it and who is already keeping it. She said, "Okay, Pop, Pop." Walter nodded. He looked at Steve Harvey. He said, "Good show." Steve Harvey said, "Good man." The episode aired 9 weeks later. The clip, Walter's story, Steve walking off stage, the return, the check, Zoe's face, the final advice, spread in the immediate, complete, across every boundary way that only a small number of things spread, which was the way that things spread when they touch something that every person alive, regardless of age or circumstance or background, has or wants or has lost or is afraid to lose. People who were 95 years old and people who were 17. People who had been married for decades and people who had never been married, and people who were not sure they wanted to be married and who watched the clip and became less sure about their uncertainty. People who had lost someone and people who still had them, and people who called the people they still had after watching the clip, which was reported in the comments section by so many different people that it became its own genre of response. I called my mother, I called my father, I called my husband, I told my wife I loved her. I went home and held my daughter, I wrote a letter. The letter writing was its own thing. Zoe's final exchange with Walter, "Write him letters, whoever he is, you'll want them later," spread in a direction that was unexpected and specific. People who had watched the clip and who then, that evening or that week, had written a letter. Not a text, not an email, a letter. People in their 20s and 30s and 40s who had not written a physical letter in years who found themselves writing one because a 95-year-old man on a game show had told his 17-year-old great-granddaughter to keep them. The letters were to spouses and parents and children and friends, and people they had not spoken to in a long time, and people they spoke to every day, and people they had not yet told what they meant. Several people mailed them. Several people kept them in boxes, on shelves, in drawers. Walter Gaines went home to Cleveland. He went home to the house he had built and to the room where the brown box now sat on his nightstand rather than on the top shelf of the closet, because he had moved it there after Ruth died and had not moved it back. He had read the letters. He had read all of them, in the order she had put them in, beginning with the first one, the letter he had written in 1952 when he was courting her, when he was 23 years old and she was 21 and the world was what it was, and he had written her a letter anyway because she was worth writing to, and he knew it. He had read them all. He had put them back in the box in the order she had put them, and he had kept the box on the nightstand. He said the box was not sad to have there. He said it was the opposite of sad. He said Ruth had made it the opposite of sad, which was the kind of thing Ruth had always done. He said, in the brief interview that Keisha arranged, and that he agreed to because Keisha asked him, and because he had always found it hard to say no to Keisha, that the afternoon had given him something he had not known he needed, which was a room large enough to say the thing that had been in him for 3 years. He said he had been carrying the story, Ruth and the box and the letters and what she had said, in the specific, careful way that a person carries something precious and private that has no obvious place to go, and that the room had been the place. He said he was glad the room existed. He said he was grateful to Steve Harvey for asking the question that opened it. He said, he asked me to tell him something about her. A lot of people ask how she passed. He asked me to tell him something about her. That is the right question. He said that was the question he was going to keep. Zoe, 17, going on 18, wrote a letter that winter. She wrote it to no one specific. She had not yet met whoever the letter was for. She wrote it to the future person, to the person she was going to love the way Walter had loved Ruth, which was a person she did not yet know, but that she was, for the first time and with some clarity, beginning to understand she was going to want. She wrote the letter and she put it in a box. She had not told anyone about the box. She had not told her mother or her friends or anyone at school. It was a box for the future and for the person in it, and it was hers until then. She put it on the shelf of her closet. She had written the date on the outside. She was keeping it. There is a love that lasts 71 years, and that is sealed in the last week of it, with a box of letters returned in order with the words, "You have been a good man, and I want you to know I know it." That love walked onto a game show stage at 95 years old and answered 5 survey questions correctly and won $20,000. But the $20,000 was the smallest thing in the room that day, as it had been, according to Steve Harvey, since before the game began. The largest thing in the room was the story. The largest thing in the room was always going to be the story. Walter knew it. Steve Harvey knew it. A 17-year-old named Zoe put a box on a shelf and is keeping it. She is writing toward the story she is going to have. She started the night her great-grandfather told the room what 71 years of love put in a box looks like when you open it at the end. She is keeping the letters. She is going to want them later. If this story reached you, if Walter's story landed somewhere real, or if you felt the weight of the brown box, or if you found yourself thinking about what you would want the person beside you to know, share this today. Call the person. Write the letter. Tell them now while the telling is still yours to do. Leave a comment below and tell us what you are carrying from this story, because this community is made of people who carry things, and your voice here matters. And if you are not already with us, subscribe right now, because every single week we come back with stories exactly like this one. Stories about the rooms large enough to hold the most important things. Stories about the man who was asked to tell something about her and who told the right thing. And stories about what love looks like after 71 years when you open the box. We will see you in the next one.